We operate on a deeply ingrained assumption that mental fortitude, discipline, and intellectual rigor are the primary tools for solving any problem. We believe that if we can engineer our way out of a logistical crisis, we can engineer our way out of internal emotional distress. Yet this creates a visible paradox. It is often the most disciplined, logically rigorous individuals who struggle the most with internal psychological friction, such as chronic anxiety or grief. Their primary tool seems to fail them exactly when they need it most. Imagine a single droplet of water disturbing a perfectly still pond. Imagine trying to flatten those ripples by violently pressing your hands against the surface. Applying your executive function, your intellect, to suppress an internal emotional state does not regulate that state. It acts as a mechanical agitator. You are adding kinetic energy to a system that requires stillness to settle. The philosopher Sri Bhadava identified this specific failure mechanism. He argued that the concept of mental firmness, the idea that we must deploy willpower to conquer our feelings, is a biological and philosophical category error. To understand why, we have to mechanically deconstruct human consciousness. We must separate the biological event of a thought from the active process of thinking, and map exactly why applying logic to an emotional reaction is guaranteed to fail. We fail to regulate our emotions not because we lack willpower. We fail because we are aggressively applying the wrong neurological tool for the job. To solve the paradox of emotional control, we first need to correctly map the architecture of human cognition. This schematic divides our cognitive architecture into two distinct subsystems. On one side is the emotional part, responsible for consciousness and sensation. On the other is the intellectual part, our executive function. The intellectual part operates as a binary engine. It is designed exclusively to navigate, analyze, and manipulate the physical, external world. It evaluates data to produce actionable solutions. The emotional part, conversely, functions purely as an internal sensory system. It registers experiences and generates physical reactions. It logs data, but it does not evaluate or solve it. This division reveals a strict mechanical separation between a thought, what ancient texts called chintana, and thinking, or chintithal. A thought is a spontaneous, unprompted neurological variable. It is an automatic output from the emotional system with a microsecond lifespan. It flashes into existence and immediately begins to dissipate. Thinking is an active, sustained engagement. It occurs when the intellect latches onto that transient thought and attempts to problem solve it as if it were a physical obstacle. A negative thought itself does not cause ongoing psychological distress. That distress is generated by the intellect trying to think its way out of a transient thought. We can observe this friction clearly when we look at the physiological reality of how the brain processes an emotional event. This chart tracks the chemical half-life of an emotion. The data shows an immediate, violent upward spike in response to a stimulus, followed directly by a smooth, rapid, natural decay curve back to a neurological baseline. Think of this initial reaction as a lightning flash. It is instantaneous, instantly dumping a chemical residue into your nervous system. The emotional reaction happens entirely outside of your conscious control. It strikes, releases its payload, and is over before you even realize it occurred. The intellect's registration of that emotion is the thunder. By the time your intellect formulates a conscious thought about the feeling, the actual initiating event is already in the past. You are hearing the noise of a strike that has already vanished. Here is where the system breaks down. When the intellect attempts to fix the emotion, it generates a secondary, artificial spike. Applying willpower or intellectual worry to the emotion interrupts its chemical half-life. Instead of allowing the neurotransmitters to flush from the system, the executive function creates a self-sustaining loop of anxiety. At age 16, the philosopher Ramana Maharshi experienced a sudden, overwhelming physiological fear of death. He stands as an empirical case study in cognitive mechanics. Rather than fighting the lightning of his own intense fear or trying to logically reason his way out of it, he simply lay down and accepted the physical sensation without intellectual resistance. He achieved a stable psychological baseline by letting the chemistry exhaust itself. Attempting to control an emotion with logic is like fighting the thunder. You are battling a chemical ghost that has already passed. This raises a critical operational question. Why exactly does the intellect's attempt to suppress an emotion force that emotion to reactivate? A classic Zen case study illustrates this. A king is given a potent medicine by a physician, but with one strict condition. The medicine will only work if the king takes it while not thinking about a monkey. We can model this problem on a neurological level. Imagine the concept of the monkey as a central node in the brain's network. The king's intellect deploys a suppression algorithm, a scanning line constantly sweeping the network to ensure the forbidden thought is absent. The fatal flaw in this logic is mechanical. To ensure the brain is not thinking of the monkey, the executive function must continuously generate the concept of the monkey to verify its absence. The very act of checking amplifies the target. The harder the intellect tries to avoid the thought, the more dominant the thought becomes. This exact mechanism governs human anxiety. When you deploy willpower to suppress feelings of panic, grief, or inadequacy, your intellect is constantly checking the status of those emotions. We call this the reentry loop. The direct command to not feel anxious mathematically requires the brain to continuously summon the chemistry of anxiety. This brings us to a final mechanical objection. If the intellect is not supposed to manage our pain, grief, or fear, how do we process them? Consider a dark room. When you bring a candle into that room, its light reveals the shapes of the furniture and objects hidden in the darkness. The intellect is the candle. It is an external light source required to illuminate, evaluate, and navigate the physical objects of the outside world. Without it, we cannot interact with our environment. But there is a crucial distinction regarding the flame itself. To see the candle flame, you do not need to shine a flashlight on it. The flame requires no secondary light. It is entirely self-luminous. Psychological states operate on this exact principle. Pain, joy, and grief are self-reporting mechanisms. They are pure awareness, requiring zero intellectual light to be known or processed. The philosopher J. Krishnamurti provided a striking example of this framework in action. During a voyage from India to England, he encountered an event that would test the limits of cognitive endurance. While isolated at sea, Krishnamurti received a telegram bearing news of his brother's sudden death. He processed the devastation not by analyzing it, seeking comfort, or applying mental firmness. He simply allowed the grief to exist in its raw, physiological state. He applied zero intellectual friction and offered no resistance to the pain. Emotions are not logistical problems to be solved by the intellect. They are self-luminous sensory events that require nothing more than passive observation to naturally exhaust themselves. This mechanical model provides a specific definition for what ancient texts call mukti, Zen, or liberation. It is not the eradication of negative emotions. It is not the achievement of an unbroken state of happiness, nor is it the mastery of dark thoughts. Liberation is simply the systemic realization that the intellect has absolutely no jurisdiction inside the emotional mind. When faced with internal distress, the instruction manual is brief. Withdraw the hands. Allow the chemical reality of the emotion to execute its natural lifespan.